Hey everyone, thanks for coming to hang out with me again today. If you're new here, my name's Jess. I'm getting ready to start crafting for summer, so I've gathered up some of my favorite projects that I've done in the past. I put them all into one video to give you some summer crafting inspiration. I'm really excited to share these projects with you. I hope you're excited too. Let's get started. On a recent trip to the Dollar Tree, I found these bamboo hoops at my store, which I'd seen other people haul, but this is the first that I saw them. And I had a really cool idea for a plant shelf. So I needed 2 packs of these bamboo rings, and I'm only going to use the larger rings for this project, so I'll save the smaller rings for another time. And I also need a pack of these wall shelves that you can find at the Dollar Tree. There's actually 2 in a pack, but I only need 1 for this project as well. I decided to leave both of my rings and my shelves just the natural wood color that they already were because I liked how they looked. For the rings, I took some thicker jute cord. I get this one from Walmart. It's a little thicker than the stuff that you can find at the Dollar Tree. And I just added a little hot glue to the outside of the ring, and I started wrapping the jute cord until I had about 1.5 inches wrapped, and then I double backed on itself because I wanted to make sure that there was a thicker amount of jute wrapped around this ring. So once I had about 1.5 inches wrapped around, then I went back the other direction, and so it's basically a double layer of jute that I had wrapped just in one place, and I did that on both rings. Next, I used my ruler to find the center point of the 2 longer sides on the shelf, and I used a pencil to mark where the center was. I did my best to line the jute cord up with the center points on the shelf, and then I used a piece of painter's tape to tape the 2 top pieces of the rings together, if that makes any sense, because I needed the right angle before I could glue the rings to the shelf. I added a little hot glue, and I knew this would hold well because of the texture of the rope, which is one of the reasons that I actually used the rope on there. It added a little element of decoration, and it was also functional. So once I had them tacked in place with a small amount of hot glue, then I turned the whole thing over and I added more hot glue on the bottom just to make sure that it was really secure. So the key with this is after you get that hot glue on the bottom, you have to really let it set up before you can move on to the next step. I took the painter's tape off of the top of the rings, and I'm using another piece of that thicker jute cord, and I tied it around the 2 rings, and then once I cut off a little of the excess on the shorter tail, then I used the longer tail to wrap it around the top of the rings. It's kind of hard to see at this angle, but I did start off to one side so that once I started wrapping the jute down, then the whole piece of jute would be centered on the top of the rings. Wanted to have the option of either setting this somewhere or hanging it somewhere, and since there were already holes drilled into this wall shelf, it made it really easy to be able to hang this if I wanted to. There is some white rope that comes with this wall shelf kit, but since I was using jute cord everywhere else, I decided to use the same jute that I was already using to hang this. So I strung the jute from the top down through the bottom, and then I added on a wood bead that's actually the same color as the wood in the ring and the shelf, so it all was nice and cohesive. And then I added a few knots to make sure that bead wasn't going to go anywhere. I measured out how long I think I needed the rope to be to hang it, and then I fished the other end down through on the other side. And I did the same thing. I added a bead and I tied a few knots just to make sure that everything would stay in place. And then of course I repeated that on the other side of the shelf as well. I gathered both sets of loops up towards the top of the rings, and I made sure that there was a good amount of tension on the strings coming from the shelves. And you'll be able to see here in a minute that my loops actually weren't the same length, and that's okay. I was able to make some adjustments later so that I could still hang it if I wanted to. I used another piece of jute just to help tie those 2 pieces together, and I made sure that I tied it in a double knot to make it really secure. I took all 4 strands that were coming up from the shelf and I tied one big knot as far up as I could. Now, because I had one loop that was slightly shorter than the other, I tied the knot up as high as I could where that shorter loop was, and then once I had my knot in place, I just clipped off the shorter of the 2 loops and added just a tiny amount of hot glue to make sure that that rope wasn't going to go anywhere. And once the glue was all set and dried, you couldn't see that there was another piece of rope tucked down in there. And then I just cut off the extra tails of that piece of jute that tied the 2 loops together. I don't always do this, but this jute cord that I was using seemed to be awfully fuzzy, so I took a lighter and I just lightly went over each of the jute cords just to burn off some of those extra fuzzy pieces. I had this really pretty blue jar on hand from the Dollar Tree last year, I believe. So I added that to the center of the shelf, and then I just tucked in a few of my favorite pieces of greenery. I had been keeping my eye out for these galvanized wall vases from the Dollar Tree, and I was really excited when my store finally got them in. I wanted to jazz it up a little bit so that I could add some sunflowers to it to brighten up my home's decor. In addition to the wall vase, I'm using some of these super jumbo craft sticks from Walmart, a little bit of ribbon, and of course some sunflowers. I started by taking a measurement on the side of the wall vase. I measured in between the 2 lips that ran around the vase, and it measured about 1 7/8 of an inch. Then I took out one of my favorite craft room tools, my paper trimmer, and I started cutting these craft sticks down to that size. Also, just a word of warning, I had a bugger of a time getting the sticker off of the front of this wall vase. I had to use my heat gun, I had to use a scraper tool, and then even after I got all the paper off, there was so much sticky residue on the front that I had to use some rubbing alcohol on the front to get the rest of that residue off. So just a fair warning, and if you are going to use a heat gun to get your label off, just be really careful because that metal heats up really fast. Now that my wall vase is nice and cleaned up, I took the craft sticks that I had cut apart and I just started hot gluing them around the outside. I glued the first one down over the seam in the container, and that was towards the bottom, so it did lift it up more than the other craft sticks, but you couldn't really tell. And I got really lucky because when I got to the end, I didn't have to cut any of the craft sticks lengthwise to fit on there. I was able to leave just a tiny little gap, and they all fit around the outside perfectly. I like the natural color of the craft sticks, but if that isn't your style, you could always paint or stain those. I would just recommend doing that before you glue them around the outside. I also decided to take out the jute rope that they had in the hanger and I replaced it with some of this black and white gingham ribbon. I filled the inside of the pocket with some smaller pieces of floral foam, and then I just started going to town adding in my favorite pieces of greenery and some of the new fall picks that I found at the Dollar Tree, and of course some sunflowers. Now I wanted some of my florals and flowers to hang down over the front, so that's why I chose not to decorate the front pocket of this wall vase. But if you want to just stick in tiny flowers that poke up through the pocket, I would say you could decorate the front with some stickers or even some really cute window clings. That would be an easy way. I think the window clings would stick right to it. You wouldn't have to Mod Podge them down, or you could just glue on some more flowers or even a big bow. I'm always trying to come up with new twists or spins for wood bead garlands because I love using them so much in my decor. I found this really cool pack of black and white buffalo plaid wood beads on Amazon. I'll make sure that they're linked below. And I also grabbed some just plain wood beads and these mini sunflowers. I wanted to get all of the wood beads strung on before I started adding in the sunflowers. Anytime I'm stringing beads onto jute, I always like to add a dab of hot glue to the end, let it cool for a few seconds, and then roll it in between my fingers. And it makes it a lot easier to string it through the beads. I started by taking 3 of the regular wooden beads, then I added a black bead, a buffalo plaid bead, and another black bead, and then another 3 beads. So that's the pattern that I'm going to continue with the whole way down the length of the garland. I didn't tie off either end of the garland yet because I needed some slack so that I could slide the beads around to add my sunflowers. I clipped one of the mini sunflowers as close as I could to the little plastic part, and then I added some hot glue to reinforce the plastic backing that was on it. I placed it underneath the jute cord in between the 2 sets of wooden beads, and then I added a leaf on the back. That way it gave it more of a finished look. If the garland flipped around and you saw the back side of it, you would just see the leaf, but from the front side it has a cute little sunflower in between the sets of wooden beads. To finish off my wood bead garland, I decided to create some simple jute twine tassels. I always like to use my sanding block. I think it's a good size to make tassels for garlands. I wrap the jute around about 20 times. I tie it in the center with the end of the garland. Instead of using a second piece of jute, I just strung the end of the garland through there and tied it on. That way it was tying off the end of the garland and also tying it onto the garland in one step. Once I had it tied onto the garland, I just had to snip the back side of the sanding block to get all the fringy pieces off, and then about 1 inch down from the top I tied another piece of jute cord and I finished it off with a piece of black and white gingham ribbon. I grabbed 2 of these 6x8 canvas frames from the Dollar Tree, some of the larger craft sticks, and also a bit of the nautical rope to create a really fun and easy lantern. I didn't want the staples showing on this frame, so I grabbed my wire cutters, which is usually the easiest way for me to remove the staples out of these. I think they actually make little tools to remove staples, but I don't have one. Let me know in the comments if you have one and if it works a little bit easier, because sometimes I do struggle a little with these wire cutters. Sometimes I have to get a screwdriver in there too. But I found it easier just to pull the staples out of the canvas and the wood all in one step, rather than cutting the canvas off and then going back through and removing the staples. I grabbed 14 of those craft sticks, and using my paper trimmer I cut all of them down to 5 inches in length. To create the box for the lantern, I took one of the craft sticks and I hot glued it in the bottom corner of one frame, and then I just hot glued it to the bottom corner of the other frame. Then I took another craft stick and I hot glued it to the 2 top corners of the frame, and I repeated it on the other side. That way I had the base and the top established first before I needed to lay down my other sticks. I spaced out 5 sticks in between the top and the bottom just to give me a quick guide as to where I would need to place them. Anytime I have to space things out like this, when I'm gluing it down, I always go back and forth between the bottom and the top. So you can see I glued down the next to the last on the bottom, then I moved to the top and back and forth. That way, as I'm gluing things down, I can adjust the spacing as I need to make it a little more even. After all the sticks were glued in place on both sides, I got to work on painting my lantern. As much as I love neutral decor pieces, sometimes I really like something with some color, and I love this moss color by Waverly. I've heard from some of you that your Walmarts don't carry the Waverly paint anymore. Mine still does, so I actually bought extra of the colors that I really like because I'm going to be really sad whenever my Walmart stops carrying this paint. After my paint had dried, I did go back through with a dry brush, and I dry brushed on some white paint just to give it that distressed look. I wanted my lantern to have some handles, so I cut 2 equal lengths of that nautical rope. I tied a knot in each end of the rope as close as I could to the end. The excess rope that was hanging off the end of the knot, I just trimmed as close as I could to the actual knot. I added some hot glue to the center, and then I held it up against the side of the lantern until the glue had cooled down. That way I knew it was set in place, and I repeated that on both sides with both handles. The Next time you're at Dollar Tree, keep an eye out for these larger wall stickers that they have. When you combine these with some of that canvas material, you can create a really simple wall hanging. I took one of the smaller pieces of the material and I cut all of the excess off. It was really easy to do this because there are crease lines where it wrapped around the frame. So I was able to cut right along those lines to get a nice even piece of canvas. I have these giant craft sticks that I got from Walmart, so I took 4 of them and I cut them down to be about a ½ an inch wider than my piece of canvas. I think after I had cut that canvas material down, it was about 6 inches, so I cut each of these sticks down to 6½ inches. You can paint or stain these sticks any color you'd like, but for my project, I decided to keep mine just the natural wood. I ran a bead of hot glue along the bottom of one of the sticks and I laid my canvas on top of it. Then I took another one of the sticks and I put a good amount of hot glue all over the surface and I kind of sandwiched that canvas in between the 2 sticks. And then I repeated that on the bottom of the canvas as well. I took some ribbon from my stash. I added hot glue to the edges of both of the sides of the craft sticks, and then I added hot glue to the back side of the canvas and wrapped the ribbon around to the back. I repeated that on the top too to create a border in the center of each of the craft sticks. To make an interesting hanger for this wall hanging, I decided to take some jute cord. I glued it to one side of the canvas and I added some clear tape just to make it secure. Then I strung on 6 wooden beads and I hot glued the other side of the string to the other side of the canvas, so that way when I hung it up I could drop 3 of the beads down to one side and 3 to the other. I added a bunch of greenery to the top of my wall hanging, and I used one of those stickers from that sticker pack from the Dollar Tree that has a little, it looks like an aloe plant to me. I don't know, maybe it's some other kind of succulent. I stuck it in the bottom right hand corner, and then I used my Cricut to cut out a decal that said she believed she could, so she did. Now it's summer, so I'm in summer mode. That's why I decorated this with greenery and succulents. But I also think you should keep this in mind because I think these would make really cute Christmas presents. You could put a Christmas saying on there and some Christmas stickers, and of course you could use some Christmas greenery at the top. Sometimes I get asked what I do with all of the projects I create, and for the most part I use them or I give them away to family and friends, but sometimes I repurpose them. I have 2 of these tag signs from Easter that I had painted one time for a project, and I also have some wooden letters that spell out USA and a wooden star that I'm just going to use for a pattern. Now I already took all the embellishments off of these 2 tags, but there is some residual glue left over, so I'm just using my sanding block to get all of that glue off before I move on to painting them. I wanted to turn these 2 tags into one big sign, so I lined them up with the bottoms together. I used a little piece of painter's tape to hold it in place, and then I cut down a larger craft stick so that I could hot glue it over the seam of where the 2 signs meet. I used some of the Dollar Tree spackling and a leftover piece of craft stick, and I ran it along the seam between the 2 signs just to make it a little smoother. After the spackle had dried, I took my favorite chalk paint, the Plaster Color by Waverly, and I gave my new sign 2 coats of this paint. Then I moved on to my wooden letters, and I'm using the Crimson Paint by Waverly, and I gave each of these letters just 1 coat. Whenever I'm doing craft projects, I try to plan out what all needs painted first, so that way I can set everything aside to dry while I move on to everything else. I only had 1 of these wooden stars, but I needed 3 of them altogether, so I decided just to take a scrap piece of cardboard and I traced out 3 stars on the cardboard and cut them out with my utility knife. I found this scrapbook paper at Joann Fabrics and I thought it would be perfect for this sign, and all 3 of my stars actually fit on one piece of paper, so I laid my stars out and traced them and cut them out. I did mark on the cardboard and the paper where the top of each star was before I cut it out. That way I could line them up better once I needed to glue the scrapbook paper onto the front of the star. Because these were traced from a pattern and I cut them by hand, some of the points were a little bit longer than others and the stars weren't exactly symmetrical with each other, so it just helps that I marked them so that it made it easier to line the paper up. And I always like to use this art glitter glue anytime I'm using scrapbook paper because I think it has a really quick hold, but it doesn't warp the paper like Mod Podge can. So I just added a thin layer of that, and then I lined my scrapbook paper star up on my cardboard star. To hide the edge of the stars where you could still see the cardboard, I took some of this thin macrame cord that I got from Amazon. I'll make sure that it's linked in the description box below. And I just ran a bead of hot glue along all the edges of the stars, and I outlined all of them with this macrame cord. Now that the paint is dry on all of my wooden letters, I could hot glue one letter to the center of each of the stars. Before adding all of the embellishments to my sign, I decided that I wanted it to have more of a distressed look, so I'm using some of the mineral color by Waverly, and I'm just dry brushing around the edges of the sign and through the center a little bit. Now, some places in the center I felt like I had just a little too much of the mineral color, so I went back through with my sanding block and just sanded it off to reveal more of that white through it. I could still see where the two tags had met in the center, so I used that as my guide to know where to place my center star. I glued that one down first, and then I just eyeballed the other two on either side of that one and spaced them out as even as I could. I wanted to create some scrappy bows for either side of my sign, so I gathered up a bunch of ribbons that I had in my stash that were either red and white, blue and white, or just red and blue. I just gathered up everything that I thought looked good together. I cut a bunch of pieces of ribbon down to about 5-inch lengths, and then I either dovetailed the ends of the ribbons or I just cut them into a point. Once I had all my ribbons prepared, I laid them down in an X pattern on my work surface, and then I just cinched them in the middle and tied them with another piece of string. I got this cute set of wooden beads from Amazon that are all patriotic themed, and one of the beads is a star shaped, so I hot glued that to the center of each of my bows. Before gluing my bows onto my sign, I wanted to create the hanger for the sign first. So I strung some jute twine through the left-hand side of the sign, and then I strung on a bunch of those patriotic wooden beads that I had told you about, and then I tied the string to the other side of the sign. To finish off my sign, I just hot glued a bow to each side. Here's a better look at those wooden beads that I was talking about that I got from Amazon. In addition to these, I'm also going to use some of these Wicker Stars that I got from Amazon and that macrame cord again, and then I found this really cool bundle of ribbon from Michaels that had all different kinds of patriotic ribbon in it, and I'm going to create a really fun garland. I started by looping one end of my garland over and attaching it with some hot glue, and then I took this thinner cord that I had on hand, that's actually from the Dollar Tree, and I just wrapped it around several times to give those raw edges a finished look. One of the elements of my garland is going to be a ribbon tassel, and the ribbons in that bundle were about 3 feet long, so I laid them out in an S pattern so that each length would be about 12 inches. I gathered them up and I tied them in the center with another piece of that cord from the Dollar Tree, and then about 3/4 of an inch down from the top of where I had tied it, I tied another piece in place. I trimmed off the bottom lengths on the tassel so that all of those loops were cut and everything was the same length. Then I took another piece of ribbon from that pack and I just hot glued it around the cord at the top to give it a finished look. For the second element on my garland, I'm using those Wicker Stars, and I strung some of that thinner cord from the Dollar Tree through the top. I hot glued the two ends together, and then I was able to string on a few of those patriotic beads. Unfortunately, I forgot to hit record before I tied everything onto the macrame cord, but I'll show you what I did anyway. I laid my ruler out and I started with one of the stars. I tied it on and then I measured about 4 inches down and I tied the next thing on. Now when I tied them on, I made sure that they were pretty snug but loose enough that I could still slide them back and forth on that macrame cord so that I could adjust everything once it's hung. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you probably know that I love to make sets of coasters, so I actually don't have a set of nautical inspired coasters. I grabbed 4 of the mini pallets from the Dollar Tree and also one of these mini crates, and I'm basically just going to give these a paint job. Since the mini crate already had 3 lines on the long sides of it, I decided to use the plaster color and paint that on the short sides, and then I use the plaster color to paint the top and bottom section of the long sides. And I actually used the Ocean color by Waverly. It's a really pretty dark blue, and I painted the center section of each side of the crate with that color. I decided to paint each of the coasters slightly different. So for some of them, I alternated the 2 colors, the plaster and the ocean. Some of them I painted the plaster on the outside pieces and I painted the ocean on the inside pieces, and on one of them I reversed it. It's really up to you how you want to customize this. I think it's really fun to go in and kind of do your own thing. After my paint was dry, I did go over all of the surfaces of the coasters with 1 coat of Mod Podge just to help waterproof it a little. As a final embellishment on my crate, I took some thicker jute twine that I got at Walmart and I just wrapped each handle of the crate with a row of jute twine. I'm always looking for ways to use up craft supplies that I already have in my stash. So for this project, I'm using some of these giant craft sticks, an old piece of art that I got from the Dollar Tree, and a wooden heart also from the Dollar Tree. I started by taking this square piece of art and I removed the hardware from the back, and then I used my utility knife to cut away the canvas design. And I wasn't worried about taking out the staples for this project because I knew they wouldn't be in my way. Next, I got out my paper trimmer and I cut my craft sticks down to fit my frame. I cut one first and made sure that it was a good length, and then I cut the rest of them the same lengths. Depending on what size frame you'll use, you'll have to take your own measurements to figure out how long you need your sticks and how many sticks you'll need for your piece. Now I could get to work on painting everything. I took my favorite color by Waverly, the plaster color, and I gave the frame 1 medium coat. I left a little of the wood show through here and there, but it wasn't just a dry brushing. It was a little more opaque than that. While my frame was drying, I got to work on the wooden heart, and because I didn't really have the perfect watermelon color that I needed, I decided to make my own, and I used mostly the ballet slipper color by Waverly, and I added just a touch of the crimson to it to deepen it up slightly. I set the heart aside to dry and I got to work on the craft sticks. I started with the fern color and I gave each of the craft sticks 1 pretty good coat of this color. Once that first coat of green had dried, I took the moss color, also by Waverly, and I dry brushed it with a smaller brush right down the center to sort of mimic the stripes that are on a watermelon. I also used the plaster color again to dry brush around the edges of the heart to give it a little more character. As a finishing touch for my watermelon heart, I took this black Sharpie paint pen and I used it to draw on some little seeds. The seeds that I drew on were teardrop shape, and I tried to turn them in different directions so it didn't look like it was all kind of uniform and going in the same way. I wanted it to look kind of sporadic and random. Now that all my paint was dry, I could start assembling my frame. I started with the craft sticks, and I'm using some hot glue to attach them to the back side of the frame. I just kind of eyeballed where the center was, and I laid my center stick down first, and then I worked my way out to both sides so that when I got to the end of the frame, it was a little bit easier to see how much of the width of the stick that I needed to trim off to fit within the back side of my frame. And the last thing I needed to do to finish off this piece of watermelon art was use some hot glue to glue my heart down to the center. I had an idea for a really fun buffalo plaid painted watermelon sign. I started by taking one of the round signs that you can find at the Dollar Tree. Now these aren't real wood, they're kind of that particle board MDF, so it makes it really easy to cut through. And I always find it's easiest if I use my cutting mat because the measurements are right on there. So whenever I'm cutting through these particle board type signs, I always take my utility knife and I just apply light pressure as I'm establishing my line, and then once I have the line in place, then I can go back through and press a little bit harder. But I find it's easier if I go over it several times rather than trying to cut through it like in 1 or 2 strokes. Then I just took half of the sign and I gave it one good coat of the plaster color by Waverly. After my paint was dry, I took my 1-inch painter's tape and I'm just using that as a guide around the rounded part of my sign so that I knew where I needed to paint the buffalo plaid versus what I needed to leave painted green for the rind of the watermelon. So that was just to give me kind of a basic idea of a 1-inch gap around the outside, and then I just used my pencil to sketch it in so that I knew where I needed to paint. I started in the center of my sign with my 1-inch painter's tape, and I just laid down pieces of the painter's tape, and I used a smaller piece to create a spacer in between each one so that my stripes would all be the same width. For the first layer of paint, I'm using mostly that ballet slipper color that I showed you in the first project with just a touch of the crimson color. And you can see I'm just taking my time at making sure that I'm painting right up to my pencil line, but I'm not going over it, and I'm filling in all of the stripes. For the second layer of the buffalo plaid, I'm doing the same technique, but I'm painting in the opposite direction. So you can see here, I'm laying my tape down in the opposite direction. And I think I mentioned it earlier, but I always like to start in the center of the project because I think it just helps make the stripes more evenly spaced. So once I had all of my stripes in place going the other way, I just added a little more of that crimson color to my first paint mixture to make it slightly darker, and I made sure again that I was painting up to the pencil line but not going over it. And for the third step, you can see that I left my horizontal striped pieces of tape on there, and I'm going back through and I'm relaying down tape where I had originally laid it. It's a little hard to see on camera, but in person you can tell where the lighter spaces are and where the darker spaces are, and you just want to make sure that you're laying that tape back down in the same position that you did on the very first step. And then for this paint color, I added even more of the crimson to that paint mixture to make it a little darker, and that was my last layer of paint. For the rind of my watermelon, I'm going through with the Fern color by Waverly, and I'm just taking my time and going right up to the pencil line, now going in the opposite direction, and I filled in the entire rind of the watermelon with that green color. I wanted to add just a few embellishments to this sign. So to cover up any imperfections on that line between the buffalo plaid and the watermelon rind, I found some of this white trim in my stash, and I just laid a bead of hot glue down and ran that trim along that line. Then I gathered up a bunch of ribbons that I had in my stash in different colors of pink, green, black, and white, and I created a scrappy bow just by cutting lengths of the ribbon and either dovetailing or cutting the ends of the ribbons to a point. I laid them out in an X-shaped pattern, and then I pinched the center of all of the ribbons together and tied it with some jute twine. Next, I hot glued the scrappy bow to the corner of the watermelon sign, and then I gathered up a few little flowers and added that to the center of the bow. I used my Cricut to cut out the word sweet, and instead of applying it with transfer tape, I just decided to apply each letter individually so that I could make it fit around the curve of the watermelon. And I did that on the opposite end, but if this is something that you don't want to do, or if you don't have a Cricut, I think another fun option would just be to take a black paint marker and either write the word yourself, or you could also use that marker to add little watermelon seeds. To make a hanger for my sign, I took another piece of that light pink jute cord and I hot glued one end into the corner, and then I secured it with a little piece of clear tape as well. I had some of these black wooden beads on hand, so I strung 10 of them onto the jute cord, and after I hot glued and taped the other end of the jute to the other end of the sign, then I was able to distribute the beads, so I put 5 on one side and 5 on other just to make a fun hanger. Thank you again for hanging out with me today. I left some videos on the screen that I think you might like. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.